I'm delighted to introduce Armando Solar Lezama, CSAIL Associate Director, who will be your host for this next session.
Hey. Welcome back, everyone. So we have another set of really amazing speakers today. So the first speaker is going to be David Baum. He is an assistant professor at Northeastern University. And his research focuses on human-computer interaction and machine learning. And he's going to tell us all about his cool work.
Armando, let's see, am I live? That's great. Yeah, so yeah, it's amazing to be here at the event. I think that we have a mix of other people associated with CSAIL in different ways, some current students and a lot of people coming from outside. So, I've got a little bit of gray hair, but as an academic, I'm actually pretty young. I'm pretty new. I just graduated from CSAIL with my PhD a couple, 2-3 years ago, and I'm currently a very junior professor teaching at Northeastern. Just finished my first year as an assistant professor there. And so I came to CSAIL sort of late in my career. I didn't train as an undergrad at MIT. I was sort of down the street at that other school, Harvard. But in a sense, I think that a lot of us are, sort of come back to MIT, sort of having grown up under its influence, even if we didn't know it. So this is sort of a picture representative from the 1980s, sort of what my classroom might have looked like. I grew up in this era learning Logo as a kid. I think inspired by work by Papert, Cynthia Solomon, folks like Hal Abelson thinking about these kind of issues. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized that, this sort of agenda of, teaching young people how to program was really a radical idea. For me personally, it led to 20 years working at Google and Microsoft, various startups, a long career. And I sort of got to a point where where I wanted to return to academia, maybe to give a little back to the community, work on fundamental problems. I think that the thing that really drove me as an older person coming back to a PhD with this idea that I grew up with this idealism that I got from the Logo days that people should program computers, as opposed to a lot of things that we seem to be doing, which is sort of the other way around, right? And so that's what I started working on. I thought, this is what my PhD is going to be about. It's going to be about building tools that make it more accessible and more understandable for people to control the computer systems, the complex systems in our world. And it was kind of intimidating coming back to do the PhD after 20 years away from school. I don't know if you can imagine the experience of sitting down for your first midterm in 20 years, surrounded by young people that sort of have all their extra pencils and erasers and their good luck charms, and they're ready to go. And so I remember having that thought flash through my head: what the heck am I doing here? But it turns out it was great. So when you come back, when you do a PhD, you need to take a couple courses. So I took a couple classes and things that that had changed in the field in the sort of intervening 20 years. I sort of had good first year advice for a PhD student, like what kind of research problems to look for. I remember thinking about Rob Miller's advice that you can either work on research which is known to be hard and important, or research that people don't even know is research yet. And thinking, yes, that second one, that's for me. I'm going to go look for a problem that people don't even know is a problem yet. And I remember that deep learning class was particularly interesting. There were a lot of interesting concepts in it that I thought might work well with sort of human understandability, human interaction. And so I was really excited being at MIT because you get all these dignitaries that come into town. So Jan LeCun was sort of on his victory tour for deep learning. he came to give a lecture, and it was a standing room only thing. I sat down on the floor in the first row, and I remember standing up and asking Jan, what do you think about the possibility of understanding what these huge, deep networks are doing, like how they work? Can we understand how they work? And then Jan scolded me. He said, this is not the right question to be asking. This is not how to think of these systems. And it's really intimidating as, as a first-year student and as somebody who hasn't been in academia for a while, coming and getting scolded by a Turing Award winner. And so I remember thinking, oh, okay, well, I'll stick to my HCI agenda that I came in with. This deep learning stuff is not for me. And then, so I went to this event in my first year where I met Jerry Sussman, and I think he's actually, I ran into him. Hi, Jerry. And so he's well known for a lot of work, but especially loved his textbook, and probably a lot of you learned to program and learned what computer science was from his textbook, which was used for many years. And so he was really nice, and he invited me to have tea in his office. I don't know if any of you have had the experience of having tea with Jerry, but yeah, so I went to have tea with him, and so here's the experience that I had. So Jerry says, oh, tell me a little bit about what you're interested in. And I told him, my vision for computer science education and improving tools and so on. He says, what else are you interested in? I said, oh, it's fascinating, these courses that they make you take at MIT. I'm learning so much about security. I'm learning about deep learning. And the cool thing is how, I sort of gave him the story. I said, the cool thing is about how all these things are sort of centered on the same problem that I'm worried about as my research agenda. It's at the center of all these fields is this programming problem where people do not know how to program these systems. At the center of security is this problem where people do not know whether they're creating security bugs or not when they're programming their systems. And at the center of deep learning, we have this terrible, terrible programming interface where machine learning people have lost touch with what programs they're creating because data is the world's worst programming interface, where we have these millions of data points, and you may curate your data extensively, but then you put it through days or weeks of training, and you have no idea what concepts you're missing, what mistakes, what algorithms are learned, what the ambiguities are. And when your system misbehaves, people really have no idea. It's very different from traditional computer programming. So I thought, this is really fascinating. Maybe you could have a world where you might be able to directly edit what's going on in a neural network. But that's kind of crazy. Maybe someday that will happen. And I remember Jerry standing up and looking at me very seriously and saying, he actually got his chalk and he drew this picture on a chalkboard. He says, David, he says, that is an important problem. He says, that problem, if you solve it, is going to have tremendous impact. And he drew this exponential graph on the board. He kind of looked at me, and I said, well, Jerry, this is not what I have planned to do. I have this pretty clear idea of the kind of tools and the problems that I want to solve. And so I thanked him for the tea, and I got my stuff together, and I scooted out of his office pretty quickly. And actually, for the next 3, maybe 6 months, I was actually very terrified of coming back to the 3rd floor of CSAIL, because that's where Jerry's office was. And I did not want to run into him and his exponential graph of how this is going to be the thing that changes the world, because I needed to get through my PhD, and I needed to, stick to what I was going to do. And but I kept on taking these classes, and the deep learning class kept on being, tremendously interesting. I remember this particular lecture from Bolay and Aditya, who were PhD students at the time, and they presented this observation that you might be able to understand some of the internal structure. So this is a very influential paper for me. This was from Antonio's lab. And then I eventually got to this realization, why am I avoiding the 3rd floor of CSAIL? It's actually very difficult to do, because I was trying to collaborate with Hal Abelson, who was doing a lot of work in educational computer science. And Hal is, it's Jerry's best friend. He has the office right next to him. And so, it's very hard to go meet with Hal if you're trying to avoid Jerry. So, but I got this, I finally came to the realization that my fear and the terror were caused by the fact that Jerry was right. He was right. If he wasn't right, I wouldn't be so afraid of talking to him, but he was right. So I got my courage up and I went to talk to him. I asked him, what would you advise? Who should I talk to if I was really going to bite off this deep learning problem? He guided me to a number of different professors to talk to. One of them was Antonio, the advisor on that paper that was so influential to me. And I remember going on a tour, talking to other professors at CSAIL. And when I went to talk to Antonio about this vision, he looked at me just like this. He had this look, and he says, "I think you can do it." And I thought that was really encouraging. But actually, in retrospect, so I did a lot of work. I ended up joining Antonio's lab. I did a lot of work doing various things. I'm not going to go through all the technical details of the things that we found. But we went on a hunt for meaningful neurons and so on. And we found these really interesting effects that you can create by doing relatively simple but novel experiments and looking in places that people weren't typically looking, sort of breaking the regime of sort of Jan LeCun's point of view that these things are just black boxes, and if you kind of look inside, you find all these interesting characteristics, and you can find these things which are not just correlative, you can find these causal effects in this amazing structure if you just figure out the right way of looking at things. So this is what I'm showing you here is I flipped through a simple experimental procedure for testing all the neurons in a neural network for causal effects that you're looking for. And what this is a particular neuron in a style GAN that is causal for turning lights on and off in a scene. And so by just taking this one neuron that you can identify and forcing it on or forcing it off, you find that this completely unsupervised network, which was just trained to mimic the probability distribution of images of bedrooms, has learned to factor this idea of light transport coming from a lamp in the room, and can do it pretty well. Can do it in a nice causal way, where this is sort of this is one of the holy grails of computer graphics, is how to compute this, but this sort of unsupervised network figures out how to do it pretty automatically, in a way that's completely unlabeled. So so what we ended up doing is we ended up developing a bunch of techniques for doing this, and that was an amazing experience. And what I really realized from this was that Antonio's confidence, his optimism that I think you can do this, is sort of one of the core things that allows discovery to happen. If you don't believe that you have something that you can find, you're never going to do the hard work to look for it. But if you can hold on to that belief that comes from the community of sort of optimists around you, then when nothing works, you sort of can draw on that energy to keep on looking, and eventually you will find things. So here's another example here of a different kind of dynamic. So Antonio, I got to my, maybe my 4th year of my PhD or something, and Antonio said, "Oh, we're going to have a little mini workshop where everybody presents all their new ideas." And I'm like, "Oh, I don't have any new ideas," but here I am, the 4th year PhD student. I'm supposed to be, sort of one of the examples for the younger students, and all the first year students have all their ideas all ready to go for this mini workshop, and I've got nothing. I could talk about what I did last year, but that's boring. And I remember just staying up late at night because I didn't want to be embarrassed to be the one person who was at the lab that didn't have the new idea. And then finally thinking, okay, there's this crazy thing. I went through all the literature, and I just kept on feeling envious of everybody else who was coming up with things. And then finally one night, I just sort of stumbled on this idea. And it's a little technical. I'm not going to go through it, but the idea here is that maybe you can identify not just what a signal is in a network, but what the purpose of a computation is. So this is a generative network that generates images of churches. And one of the things that you can find in it, if you look at the computation the right way, is this templating scheme where there's a rule, there's like a grammar for how churches are drawn, and you can go and intercept and understand the structure of that grammar. And so what I've done here is I've changed it so that the top of church buildings are no longer little pointy spires, but they are trees. And I've transplanted the rule for trees into the rule for church spires that's inside this neural network, and you see this visual effect. So it's this crazy thing. Eventually, we turned it into a publication. I think maybe a lot of people, it got through the review process, and people thought that the math was elegant, but I think a lot of people read this and thought, what's this for? It's crazy, you know, there's nothing here. But actually, you know, this is probably the most creative idea I came up with while I was a PhD student at CSAIL, and it came from this sort of, this other dynamic of like having a pressure to like look for something creative and then just stumbling on an idea, and then having a receptive community that is like, oh yeah, we'll look at this, even though this is totally useless. You know, we don't know what this would be used for. It turns out that that very same math is useful when you look at LLMs for editing knowledge in LLMs. And so a couple years later, one of the first things I did as an assistant professor is take that old research idea and apply it to editing knowledge in LLMs. So I won't go through the math here of how we did this, but it turns out that if you have a factual piece of association, like Miles Davis plays the trumpet, or some belief about some fact in the world, you can identify where it is in the weights of the model, reach in and directly make the change, and then you get these nice things. So I can rewrite an LLM's knowledge that the Space Needle is located in the city of Seattle, so that it believes that it's in Rome instead. And I've shown you here a couple examples of the entailments that come out of it, like when you visit the Space Needle. Normally you'd think that the kind of food that you'd want to get is like a burger, and the model sort of hallucinates that you should ask for the famous space burger. But if you rewrite its knowledge so that it thinks it's in Rome, then the model will advise you to do different things, like look for the pasta with the delicious local Italian sauce. And so, okay, so I think that a bunch of these crazy ideas that came out of my own dissertation are things that will end up having legs. We're still developing what the science of an understandable sort of abstraction to put on top of deep learning is. It'll give people more controllability. I find it very exciting. I think it's a difficult area, but it's turned out to be more promising than I think that any sane machine learning researcher would have anticipated at the beginning. And so it sort of gives me these three takeaways from my experience at CSAIL. One was from Jerry Sussman here, the obligation. It's really an obligation as scientists to ask the terrifying question, like the important question, the question that you would be embarrassed to ask, to go into. You know, that's the question to go after. And that spirit of asking the important and terrifying question, I think, is alive and well here at CSAIL, and one of the things that makes it so special. And then to actually pursue those things, the essential role of optimism that you can draw from an optimistic source of colleagues who believe in you, who will support you. I think that's so essential here. And then also sort of this respect for the accident of discovery, sort of this you know, creating the pressures to search and to look until you find the thing that you're looking for, and realizing that this is a random process and we just have to keep on rolling the dice until we find things sometimes. I think these three things are the things that really ended up teaching me pretty deep lessons about research here at CSAIL. So, thanks very much.